My name is Darrell Barnes, and I want to talk about the immune system. This is part 2. There's another video called part 1, which was released just the other day. And so now we're going to try to pick up adaptive immunity today. Adaptive immunity is cell-mediated immunity and antibody-mediated immunity. Before we dig in real deep into this topic, though, I do want to say that if you're my student, please study the book. That way we all agree on what we're studying on. It's not something that I said today I might have incorrectly said, hopefully not. And if you're not a student of mine, study what your teacher wants you to master for your test. I hope this is helpful for you. Honestly, I'm going to be frankly bold and say that I am a disciple of this information. I am not a master of it. I wish I was a master of it, but I'm working at it. So just bear with me. We're going to look at some detailed stuff right at first, and then at the end we're going to kind of bring it home and talk about some things that might be relevant to you. You've been around people in your life who've had autoimmune disorders or anaphylactic shock reactions, and so we're going to talk about some things that are everyday for some people in this world. So let's start with in the beginning, and let's talk about cell-mediated immunity just for one moment. The thymus is the boot camp for T cells, and these T cells, part of the cell-mediated immunity, are formed in the bone marrow, but they go to the thymus for maturation. Remember that the thymus is below the breastbone in the chest, and it's rather large in young people. It shrinks as we age. Thank you. Clones are formed. Clones are cells that respond specifically to a specific antigen, and those antigenic markers are called immunogens. In our bodies, typically self-antigens, our body is not an immunogen. In other words, our body usually doesn't trigger to attack us. The whole point of this boot camp in the T cells is to ensure immunocompetence. This is amazing to me. Self-reactive T cells are destroyed, ensuring self-tolerance with only 5% survival rate. 95% of the cells processed through the thymus can't properly recognize an antigen, or when they do recognize something, they recognize me, and so the body destroys those cells. T cells must interact with a major histocompatibility complex. And there are two classes of these complexes on the surface of these cells. There's a class 1 major histocompatibility complex, and then there is a class 2. So we're going to talk about class 1 first. These are from the inside of the cell. They are therefore called endogenous, and they are called self-antigens. They may mark the cell as self, but it may be that there's an infection, a bacterial infection, a viral infection, or even cancer inside of the cell. Here's where it gets crazy. A cytotoxic T is activated by diseased MHC class 1s. And so this is what happens. Once the cell activates the cytotoxic T, the cell itself self-destructs. And then the cytotoxic T goes into a controlled rampage. What does that mean? The cytotoxic T binds to the target cell, another cell that's sick. It releases perforins, and then enzymes go into the cell, destroys the target cell. It detaches for a wash, rinse, and repeat. Keep on attacking until all of these opponents are eliminated. There is another class of T cell that's called a helper T, and these are incredibly important. They are associated with class 2 major histocompatibility complexes. These are displayed foreign antigen fragments. They are considered to be exogenous. That means that the cell scavenges these opponents and then digests them and wears their body parts on its cell surface. It's kind of ridiculous sounding. By the way, B cells and antigen-presenting cells like macrophages are the ones that present or have class 2 major histocompatibility complexes. Well, what happens next is pretty cool as well. Helper Ts are activated by these complexes, these MHC2 complexes. Interleukin 3 is released. This stimulates phagocytosis, so your body begins eating. And then it also stimulates phagocytes to release interleukin 12, which then wraps back and activates the helper T. That's kind of cool. So it's kind of a self-perpetuating system. In addition to that, helper Ts can, as they're activated, can also activate and get the B cells into the conflict. B cells transform into plasma cells. These produce antibodies. What do antibodies do? They clump or immobilize things. They can activate complement. They can stimulate inflammation. They can stimulate a process called opsonization. In this case, the antigen is physically bound to the phagocyte, so the phagocyte will make sure to eat it. They can also neutralize toxins or venoms, for instance. Let's break down antibodies for just a minute before we move on. How are antibodies formed? Well, a B cell clone recognizes an antigen and then produces a plasma cell which produces antibodies. Antibodies are also called immunoglobulins, and they have the Ig prefix. They are also called gamma globulins, and these are what give us a memory, a self-vaccination or immunization in effect. The primary activation of these antibodies takes about 7 to 14 days. On subsequent exposure, though, maybe 1 to 5 days. For a minute, let's look at a few of the different antibody classes. IgG is a little Y-shaped drone. These look like little fighter planes to me. About 75% of the antibodies in serum are IgG. This is the only antibody that can cross the placenta. IgA looks like a dog bone, and it's found in skin, sweat, breast milk, and saliva. IgM is the largest antibody, looks like a snowflake, but know this, it is definitely a snowflake of death. It means business. And when it clumps stuff, then a macrophage will come along and scavenge the entire clump of things that it attached to. IgE is associated with allergies and parasites. I was talking with another student earlier today, and she was saying, well, aren't eosinophils associated with allergies? Yes, they are. So IgE, basophils, mast cells, eosinophils, all of these are involved in allergies, in parasites, or one of the other, or both of the above, possibly. IgD is an antibody that's found on the surface of B cells, but it is not largely secreted by B cells. Remember this, I am not a lab researcher on this information. I am a studier, a disciple of this, and a purveyor of knowledge to the best of my knowledge. So keep that in mind. Keep reading on this, and let's keep going. Next, I want to go to different types of immunity in your body. You and I can have naturally acquired active immunity by getting the chicken pox. And that way on subsequent exposures, we don't get a whole brand new outbreak of this. Now, I have understood that it can hide out and appear later, but this is called naturally acquired active immunity. Artificially acquired active immunity is where you or I get a vaccination of an attenuated organism, something that's weakened or dead. Naturally passive immunity is what a baby would get from its mother's breast milk. Artificial passive immunity is what a person would receive if they were receiving an antivenom for a venom. Toxins can be bound by artificial passive immunity. Let's move on to the next topic, and let's talk about burn victims. If a burn victim received skin from him or herself, this would be called an autograft, and this would not involve tissue rejection on a big scale. Maybe not at all. An isograft would be from a twin. An allograft would be like receiving a kidney from another person. And then a xenograft an example of that would be a person getting a pig valve, a valve from another kind of an animal. Allografts and xenografts, both of these require immunosuppressive therapy because the body will try to fight these off and not accept them. Let's go next to autoimmune diseases. This is not necessarily a pleasant topic, and I don't really think this is incredibly well understood. Remember, I told you earlier about how T cells go through a boot camp in the thymus. Well, if the T cells are not exposed to specific antigens in the body, if a person's injured and this tissue goes into circulation or parts of the tissue and then it gets exposed to some kind of tissue that it hasn't seen before, this is an unknown self-antigen that is now known, and multiple sclerosis is thought to be an autoimmune disorder along this line. There can be mimics, as in rheumatic fever. Apparently the bacterium strep can infect a person, and because apparently the antigenic markers on it resemble the heart, it will cause the body to attack the heart. There can be inappropriate MHC2 antigenic presentations. In this case, the pancreas itself can be destroyed and result in diabetes mellitus type 1. There can be non-specific B-cell activation because of a viral infection that can result in lupus. What I was reading when I looked this up was that if the person has a viral infection, then it can actually mark DNA and blood cells and all different kind of things in the body as enemy. This is what we call lupus. Lastly, I would like you to look with me at a situation that could cause us to panic. Anaphylactic shock. B cells, remember, morph to form plasma cells. These can release IgE, stimulate mast cells in the tissue. If a person has a subsequent exposure, it can release histamine into the body. If it's a massive amount, it can cause a massive effect. You've heard of people having windpipes be closing up because of an anaphylactic reaction. So, if histamine is the problem, what is the answer? Say it out loud.
Antihistamine.
An antihistamine. So this would be a really nice thing to have around the house as a first aid component. Might save someone's life. It might be yours. And I am suggesting the liquid kind as compared to a tablet that you might have to powder up in a crisis. That might be nerve-wracking trying to do that. This was Immune System Part 2. And I'm glad you came today. Keep coming back. Keep studying hard. And when you have a question, look it up and it'll lead you to the next question. That's what it does for me. Happy studying. Thank you. Holla out loud, answer the roll. Say it like you mean it, not just present, but president. Not just present, but president. Not just present, but president. I just want you to get bossy with your education. Be the disciple. Keep coming back. Remember, A is for excellent, B is for better, and C is for super.